I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
From the gates of Mount Rome to the far corners of the endless highway, wherever you are, welcome to the show.
So you believe in some kind of Armageddon?
Yeah, most definitely. We in the last times and days right now. The Illuminati's in effect.
My guest today is an author, historian, and scholar. He is the host of a show called Arcanvm. His book is called A Formless Fire. Ike Baker, thanks for coming on and being here with me, man.
Thank you for having me, Tim. It's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, same here. I think you're the first Martinist that I've ever talked with. And I didn't really know what it was until recently. I was researching Nazi occultism, which I don't associate with Martinism, but in a weird way, that's how I came to find Martinism, because I found that the Nazis, when they invaded Paris, took all of the Freemasonry material they could get their hands on. And so a lot of that stuff just ended up in Russia, and that's a long story. But I was on YouTube, and I was looking into, what came about with these documents. And there were French Freemasons talking about how they had just gotten these documents back from the Russians that had been missing since World War II. And they were talking about a Martinist faction of magicians, essentially, that they found in there. And I don't know if I'm going to say his name right, but they were talking about Pasquale. So that really, I was like, what is this? And even these French Freemasons seemed like they were kind of like, oh, it's a new discovery. He's very mysterious and stuff. So that's how I came across Martinism.
Yeah, I know that right around that time, I think 1934, 1931, in that period, there was a concerted effort by several of the members of occultism, Martinism, Memphis Mizraim, these kind of interesting side degrees that were collected in a body called Fudosi. Essentially, I'm pretty sure that Fudosi is an acronym for something in a foreign language. But what it was essentially like a grouping under which all of these kind of things can be together, grouped together, and kept so that they could be preserved through what they saw was really coming, I think. Particularly Memphis and Mizraim, and you had these esoteric orders that were trying to preserve themselves, and they kind of came together for this federation, this council meeting, and they banded together so that this way, through the coming years, they'd be able to preserve all these traditions. And they did, even though the Nazis hunted down a lot of Freemasonry. In terms of, well, they closed all of them down, right? I mean, they basically, wherever the Nazis, wherever they occupied, they basically said Freemasonry can't exist here, and they confiscated all that stuff. And obviously, Martinism is kind of an adjunct. It's associated with Masonry. It's not officially Masonic. None of these bodies really are officially Masonic. They're all based on Masonic ritual, Masonic tenets, modes of recognition, secret passwords by which you'd be known to be a member of the society, an initiated member. It's all relatively similar, different flavors. obviously the ones we're talking about here, Martinism, Memphis Mizraim, even Pasquale, which is fascinating. I'd love to get into that. The Elecones, right?
Yes.
His order of elect knight masons, elect priests of the universe, the Elecones.
What a title.
Right, exactly. It's all somewhat related, and it's all this esoteric interpretation or reinterpretation of Freemasonry.
I don't think
Particularly,
people realize how interesting it actually is either. Because when I got into his book, Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings, Pasquale's book, that some of that stuff in there is wild. It's almost like a sci-fi novel meets philosophy, religion, theurgy. I don't know. It's way more interesting than I think people realize. That's my
it's
point.
it is. It's quite Gnostic as well in some
Hmm.
sense. You'll have various commentators who have a bias, typically a religious bias that will insist that it's not, that it's perfectly Catholic, but there is some stuff in there that truthfully, if you're looking at it, I mean I did the audiobook for it, for
Oh.
Mike Osborne's translation that Rose Circle Books put out. Um,
For
it
treaties
yeah, the
of
treatise on the reintegration of
oh
beings,
wow.
and it's yeah, and so I mean I read it line for line many times. And I had read it before then. I hadn't read Michael's translation yet, obviously. But I mean, just went through that in 8 months, line for line, and really absorbing it. And when you're doing stuff like audiobook reading, you enter kind of almost into this trance state, just
Mm.
trying to get the most out of it as you can, and just in one sitting trying to roll through as much as possible, and finding a groove, a cadence, and an inflection, right? Because you have to understand what he's saying in order to be able to inflect, right? You like if you didn't understand what I was saying, you might say, well, you might understand what he's saying to inflect, and then the inflection's all wrong because I'm just reading it off the page and it doesn't sound like somebody's speaking it.
Hmm.
So, and to be honest with you, I hate that. I hate that when it sounds like somebody is reading off of a page.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it truly boils my piss. So,
Well, there's
you
an
know?
art. There's an art to doing this because I'm in Nashville. I'm a vocalist, and I've been in the booth a lot over the years, and I know it's in singing. The approach is key, but like with what we're talking about, I heard a audio version of 1984, and the guy nailed it because I've read that several times that book, right? But the way he phrased things
Yeah.
was bringing out new meaning in that book,
Yeah.
like an
But it's
art.
it's a lot of this stuff, particularly Martinism, as you're saying, is
Yeah,
is based off of. I don't know how much you know about the history of Martinism. I don't know if you want me to go into it, but I can basically give the shorter
sure.
story. So essentially, you have uh, Joaquim de la Torre, yada yada yada, this massive long name, and we know him as Martinez de Pasquale. Um, and essentially he is a transplant. It's originally his family's from Spain. They're rumored to be conversos, meaning that they converted to Christianity from Judaism. That's something that's kind of debated, but um, he finds himself. Actually, it was Pasquale's father who received a Masonic charter, a Masonic charter from the individual that was considered to be the Grand Master of Masonry, the Bonnie Prince Charlie. And so he receives this Masonic patent that grants him the ability to charter his own Masonic lodges, and that privilege passes at his death to his oldest son. And so essentially, on the strength of this patent granted to him by, the very historic personage of the Bonnie Prince Charlie, and being the Grand Master of Masonry in Europe, uh, that power enabled uh, Martina de Pasquale to sort of go around and begin doing his own thing. And so we really see him first appear. He starts trying to open these very interesting lodges, uh, Masonic lodges in like the southern Spain region, Languedoc region, but also in Bordeaux, Lyon, and Toulouse. Toulouse is a very, very important place, particularly in France, for the history of Rosicrucianism. Um, we know that as early as 1625, so just a handful of years after the Rosicrucian manifestos are first sort of, published, disseminated in Kassel, Germany in the early 1600s. Just a handful of years later, in 1625, there is a declared Rosicrucian presence in it, literally, this pamphlet nailed to the doors of churches or public places, declaring the presence of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And so that's very interesting, right? Because in the West, that's the first sort of organized, secular, secret society as we understand them today. Before that, there, of course, you have initiated priest class, you have groups of people working together, but now it's kind of different. It's more what we think of today when we think of a secret society. It really starts with the Rosicrucians. So one of the places that historically there has been a Rosicrucian presence is in Toulouse. And so you start seeing Pasquale going around and setting up these little weird temples. They're not or lodges. And he's calling them temples and things like that. And these would eventually these Masonic lodges, these unique Masonic lodges would eventually be the precursors. They were prototypes for his Elu Cohen. And the Elu Cohen, obviously, the full title, I'm not going to do it in French because I'll just butcher it, but it's the Knight Masons Elect Priests of the Universe, right? So there's a couple of things there, right? Knight Mason, so chivalric masonry, and an elect priesthood, which is super, super important. And he...
Do you think they got that or he got that maybe from the Knights Templar, or is it just something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all this stuff kind of has something to do with it.
Yeah.
Because it's rumored that actually there's a lot of conjecture surrounding this stuff. There are like large markers there, but nothing to connect to them, in terms of historical evidence. So I could sit here and speculate and kind of,
Sure.
I could feed into this, I would say, deceptively confident strain of thought that says that the Rosicrucians came out of the Knights Templar, or the Freemasons came out of the Knights Templar. But the way that that's typically presented, particularly, and stuff like Gaia Channel and all that stuff, it's deceptive. There's nothing conclusive. There's nothing conclusive. So you can't, I hesitate to commit to something like that. But there are pieces there, but I'm not willing to say it's definite. But I would say that it definitely, Pasquale, in his private letters, says, to his students, his members, we are Rosicrucians. He claims to have even been trained in a specific type of magic called theurgy, from a pre-existing Rosicrucian lodge that he was initiated in. He doesn't go into very much detail about it. So essentially, his interpretation of what Masonry is, he thinks he's restoring it to this sort of primordial religious worship that really was enacted by Seth, the third or true son of Adam and Eve. And so, that brings you into Sethian Gnosticism, which is a whole other bag of tricks and things like that, which is very, very interesting. Now, one thing that we do have in the area that I would like to point out, again, without making anything conclusive, is you do in southern Spain, the Languedoc region, you do have a history of quasi sort of neo-Gnosticism there in the Cathars, right? Then the Cather Perfecti. And so that's that. It's just really interesting that it's all kind of concentrated right there. This Rosicrucianism, this Cathar neo-Gnosticism, and then all of a sudden you get this guy Pasquale who's able to start, bringing more of that to the fore in a Masonic context. And finally, it eventuates in his interpretation of Freemasonry as he thinks he's rectifying it, and it's a lay order of Knight Mason exorcists. So they live like clergy people, and they were almost exclusively noblemen because the nobility had the leisure time, the space to be able to practice, the funds to be able to obtain the ritual items, and also, they were really the ones. Nobility were back then a lot of times, at least in title, chivalric. They were knights. They were already knights. So what he was doing was he was essentially he had created this order to practice his form of theurgy, which is to exorcise evil essentially from the, for lack of a better term, the aura of the earth. And these men did that. Now they were to pay strict obedience to the Catholic Church, go to church on Sundays, etc. But they were not officially recognized by the church, but they considered themselves to be working kind of beside the church, with the church, for the church. They considered themselves as individuals to be part of the body of the church. So very interesting stuff with him.
It's interesting. What caught my eye, and maybe it's because I was a newbie when I came and I stumbled across this stuff, but I really kept thinking in my mind that this is a sect of occult Christianity. If not to be crude and not to just boil it down into one term, but essentially I say that because it seems to parallel the Bible, a lot of his doctrine. It kind of works off of scripture from what I could tell.
Yeah, his interpretation of it, for sure.
Sure. Yeah, and it makes me wonder why ultimately he is such an enigma, why he was kind of forgotten by history and all that. Like, what happened there?
Well, I mean, one of the things is that French was not his native language. So he couldn't write it very well. For instance, like the treatise on the reintegration of beings, those were like taken from his notes and letters. And it was actually Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and Jean-Baptiste Villermoz, two of his probably most high-profile students, who posthumously collected those works and put them together and sort of in one work. And so what happens is, he managed to capture the imagination and the inspiration of some of the greatest minds of his age, because it was, you see in letters that his students write to each other, not even to him, that talking about, struggling with, I can't get these apparitions to appear. And like the master could, like Pasquale could. So they're all saying like they were convinced by this man who couldn't really, read or write in their native tongue, and yet for some reason he was able to convince a lot of these people to join the Elu Cohen and train under him and live that way. They lived like monks for the most part, and so without taking that ordination. So he was outside the Catholic Church, and he was also kind of outside, the tradition of, well, I guess what we might call regular masonry. So the Freemasons didn't really like him very much, this Freemasonic establishment, or what there was at the time, because of how far off the rails he had gone. But then also the Catholic Church was like, can't acknowledge that sort of thing. So where else is it going to be preserved? Now it's in his, in the writings and works of his students that we have a lot of it. We also have some of his letters, but you got to understand these things weren't translated until very recently. It's been 300 years in French. So the thing is, Martinism and I think Pasquale are much more well known, particularly Martinism, is extremely well known in France because you can read all the documents.
Mm.
We can't read all the
Yeah.
documents. We don't have, and that's what's crazy is like we think that we know history, but we don't, if only for the sole reason that like most of it hasn't been translated into English. Most of history has
Yes.
not yet been translated into, those documents have not been translated into English. So Rose Circle books out of the U.S., New Jersey. They're doing tremendous work because they've got writers like Matt Ravenat, like Michael Osborne, tons of others,
Hmm.
just putting out this quality material. A lot of it is translations of the French and studies on these French lines and French esoteric bodies.
Yeah, and just one more note on Pasquale. He seems like such a monumental figure. The more I looked at him, because there's a lot of strings connected to him, I think. You've got Rosicrucians, you've got Freemasons, you've got possibly, I know it's conjecture, Knights Templar, but also it seems like some of his followers after he died went on to start the first Illuminati, or at least they were using that term, Illuminati. So I thought that that was very interesting. Dom Pernitti, I think he was using, inspired by Pasquale, he was using the term Illuminati about 10 years before the Bavarian Illuminati.
Yeah, so he was using sort of the Illumines sort of title, but that
Mm,
had to do with a movement called Illuminism. Yeah, so it's yeah, the Illumines de Avignon, which sometimes gets translated as the Illuminati of Avignon, which really wouldn't have been translated that way because it's
okay.
Illumines would be the French. But so um, that had to do more with a philosophical movement called Illuminism than it did. It actually didn't have anything to do with Adam Weishaupt's Bavarian Illuminati.
Okay.
Uh, Illuminism was an interesting movement, and particularly it flourished in France and in Germany in right around that time period, right, 1700s, um, early 1800s. But it's not necessarily the same thing as the Illuminati. So what you got to understand is that in Freemasonic allegory, as in all Western esoteric allegory, the verbiage it's always seeking after light. Okay. Even in the Hermetic documents and the Neoplatonic documents, now we're going back to the first few centuries CE and the last few centuries BCE, right? You're talking, they refer to God, God is one and his substance is light. Plato, right? Now we're going way back. Plato talked about how um, the sun is the most fitting emblem for God, because it is the bestower of light, and he equated light to what he called intelligibility, which is not just knowledge, but the essence of knowledge. Um, Not just knowing things, but the capacity to know anything in and of itself. And of course, that is inherited, at least in part, from the Egyptian, ideal of Amenti being the place of the afterlife and the place where the
Mm.
sun sets, the place of darkness in the west. And then, the Akhet gate on the eastern horizon where the sun rises in the morning. Ra, right, on his solar bark, the governor of material creation. So we're always using this analogy, and even in Plato's allegory of the cave, it's in book 7 of the Republic. If you read the allegory of the cave, he even says what Masons say, how these people will be brought from darkness to light. That's what we say in Masonry. We seek to be brought from darkness to light, from the west gate to the east,
Mm.
right? So that's the processes that we're always talking about. So Illuminati has gotten like a fucking bat. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know if I could curse, but
You're fine.
it's gotten a sort of a batshit crazy connotation to it because
Hmm.
yeah, everybody that looks from the outside, you're never going to be able to figure out what's going on. There's just simply too much. Most people that make these speculations do not have an iota of understanding of what it takes to research things historically, meaning to the rigorous standards where you've covered all your bases. And then also, they'll never understand from outside of any of these fraternities because there is a subjective component that is supremely important to initiation. But so you get the Bavarian Illuminati, those guys were atheists. They sought to secularize the world, and they were not associated with Freemasonry. No Masonic body recognized them. But what they did do was they based their ritual on a Freemasonic format, and they recruited from members in Freemasonry. They infiltrated the local government where they were in Bavaria to the point where the governorate actually had to expel them and disband them. And they infiltrated to a large degree all elements of this the educational institutions, the local government, the Freemasonic circles, all of those things, but they were never Freemasonic. And so we don't want to we want to be really, really careful about how we translate these things and what the context is. Because like something like Illuminism and the stuff that came out of Pasquale, right? And that's all that stuff that was related and burgeoning at the time and other Freemasonic degrees, very, very predicated on belief in a deity, not
Yes.
secular.
Not secular,
Not
not
secular.
atheist in the least bit. Wow, almost opposite ends of the spectrum there.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Um, you have a book out. So, what got you to the point where you said, "Okay, I'm going to go with the term Martinist and I'm going to start writing books"?
Um, well, first, I guess I just want to one quick little aside so that we
Yeah.
kind of contextualize for the listeners how we arrive at Martinism. Um, Pasquale's one of his best students is a man called Louis Claude de Saint Martin, and he eventually quits the Cohens. He's done with the theurgy, and he basically says, "Well, what I think is important is what he called the way of the heart, the inward way." So he became less ritualistic and the evocation or conjuration of evil only to banish it and all the sacramentary forms and the drawing of circles and etc. He developed a practice that was highly philosophical and highly contemplative, and as it has come down to this day, right? Because he developed this system, but it was his personal system. And we don't know that he actually initiated anybody in terms of like an official order setting. But in the late 1800s, two men, Girard Anco and who is better known as Papou or Papus, and Augustin Chabousseau, they resurrect the teachings of Saint Martin and they create a kind of, Freemasonic esque order out of it. And that is where Martinism comes from. So Martinism comes from Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who studied under Martinez de Pasquale. So there's a couple of Martins there, and we don't really know
Yeah.
where we got them.
Yeah.
So that's how that happens. I started out in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I've told this story before. I had an aunt who had a tenant, and that tenant threw herself in front of a train. So my aunt called me up and she said, "Turns out this lady, while very nice, kept to herself. She was a hoarder. Can you help me, get all this stuff out of here?" We show up and there's stacks of books. It's crazy. Um, as we're kind of, getting everything into boxes and packing it up, getting it ready for donation, I see this book and it just jumps out to me. And I said, "This is a little weird, but can I take this?" And so she let me have that book, and it was called the Oracle of Kabbalah by Richard Seidman. And I walked around my neighborhood in a day after that, and I read it. I was no more informed about what I already knew concerning Kabbalah after I'd read it, but it just struck me as being okay. There's like a momentousness to this. This is the right time for me to start looking into this. So I was living on Long Island at the time, up in New York, and I went on the internet yellow pages or white pages. I typed in Long Island Kabbalah group, and this guy's information comes up, and I said, "Hey, I'm interested in studying Kabbalah," and he said, "Well, we don't, that group doesn't meet anymore, but there's this other thing," and that other thing was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So long story short, I eventually end up initiating into that system and learning ceremonial magic, undergoing alchemical initiation, all of that stuff. It completely renovated my life and changed who I was. A couple of years later, I moved down to North Carolina, where I am now, and I start running the Asheville Temple of the Golden Dawn. And I got involved. That's about the time when I got involved with Martinism and the Elu Cohen, and even, I mean, the last thing I did was initiate into Freemasonry. Believe it or not, I was like, you know what? I don't know. I prefer orders that will accept, have a co-ed basis. I understand now why it's very important, especially right now, for men to band together and bond together in that kind of an environment. It's very healthy. It's extremely supportive. And there's a lot of love and there's a lot of fraternity. And for people like me who didn't really grow up with like strong paternal figures, it is life healing. So it can be anyway. So, I'm involved in all this stuff at that time, and I'm seeing how all of the pieces fit together. And they fit together from the inside. The Golden Dawn gives me the how, but Martinism gives me the why. And then, Martinism and Elu Cohen, and then Freemasonry is kind of the whole overarching fraternal aspect, the esoteric world at large, right? And a big portion of that world of Freemasonry is not esoteric. They don't think Freemasonry is esoteric. They know very little about the origins of the fraternity and like these adjacent histories. They only know like the whole spoon-fed stuff. It's like nothing existed before 1954. So, that they like know that much about the fraternity and nothing else. And maybe a little bit of Pike, maybe a little bit of Mackey, but they're not in the know about the actual history of this stuff. So I started researching all the history to see it makes sense subjectively. In the middle of all these things, they're all coming together to form this beautiful, harmonious sort of unified whole, and so maybe the history will support that, and indeed it did, and it really did show me that it was really, I believe, a single spiritual impetus that was awakening in different times in different places and really finding different fertile ground for it to really shoot, sprout, and flourish. And so there's a lot of, pardon my French, bullshit on the internet about occultism. A lot, an overwhelming amount. So at this point I was getting a sort of prompting from my own internal processes, my own private practice, that was encouraging me, really kind of forcing me to get out here and start saying things, because I've been doing this kind of work in one form or another for about 20 or 21 years at this point, and about 20 years at this point. And done it very quietly and, kind of lived a double life, so to speak, because I come from a Catholic family and stuff like that. And it's a big no-no to do all this stuff. But now it got to the point where like magic, for some reason, and these traditions is becoming overwhelmingly popular. And so, but the thing is, it's these really kind of convoluted, potentially destructive, and I think ultimately unhealthy forms of occultism that really just carved it out like the middle of a bagel. They just they just turned it into a husk, and they're practicing it now in ways that are completely divorced from the way it was meant to be practiced.
Yeah, and it seems like even just perspective of the occult is skewed because I wonder if you think do you think that guys like Crowley and LaVey came along and kind of gave the occult this aura and the way it's thought of today, and maybe like the musicians came along after them and just finished it off for everyone. Now it's just viewed by masses of people as in a negative light.
Yeah, well, I mean, put it this way, it was always the occult, really, we don't get that term
Mm.
until about the 1800s, and it is popularized during a period called the French occult revival. So before then, like even before the Enlightenment, none of this stuff was esoteric, really, until the Enlightenment period. That's when it became sort of esoteric. Now, was it reserved for a few in ancient days? Yes. You know, the Neoplatonic tradition of theurgy, the Hermetic traditions, in those dialogues and those studies, that philosophy and that technology. Not everyone was doing it. I will say in the time of the Renaissance in the Middle Ages, there was an astrologer on every street corner. Doctors would carry astrological handbooks, and astronomical knowledge. When you could when you could perform surgery or not had largely to do with the phase of moon, right? We know what that does to the fluids on the earth, and we don't want them to bleed out. So avoid surgery during a full moon and things like this. But even more so than that, they had this anatomical drawing that kind of pointed out like where the zodiacal signs and planets, their ruling planets, kind of governed the human body and things like that. Aspects of it were very, very popular and even taught in universities until the Enlightenment. And then what happens around the same time in the 1800s, right, is the rise of scientism. You had people like Pasteur and the vivisectionists and the prophets of the coming age of scientism. And so by then, too, the Protestants had taken over the universities and pushed all of the sort of mystical stuff out, right? They hated the fact that Christian theology is predicated on Platonism, Platonic philosophy, specifically Neoplatonic, but all the moving parts in Neoplatonism come from the dialogues of Plato. That's why it's called Neoplatonism and not something else completely. Christian theology is founded on that. There are people out there talking about how they do their own research. They don't even know that the New Testament is written completely in Greek. It's not in Hebrew. It's not in Aramaic. It's in Greek. They're using Platonic terms. They're using Greek words. Logos, right? In the beginning was the word. So this stuff right around the 1800s, between it being pushed out of the academy and really kicked into the dustbin of collected knowledge by the Enlightenment, that you then have the rise of scientism.
Yeah.
And so they're saying, well, this stuff is bullshit. Now, it came back in force with things like, Allan Kardec's spiritism, what am I trying to say? The spiritualist movement started by the Fox sisters in upstate New York, the Theosophical movement of Helena Blavatsky, Henry Steele Olcott, and William Quan Judge, right? Even the people in the Golden Dawn, they combated this incoming age of really positivistic, reductive scientism. And they didn't win, but they transmitted all this stuff to us so that we could now combat that today. Now, when I say combat this stuff, I'm not trying to say get rid of it, but I'm trying to say like it's not the only way to look at the world.
Absolutely.
And it's not the only form of truth. But so at that point, you really get this stuff pushed far underground. And I don't necessarily think it was just Crowley. I certainly don't think it was just LaVey. These people had an attitude that was consonant with the burgeoning spirit of the times. And that attitude is irreverence. And it ultimately, people love Crowley and LaVey not for the silly costumes they wore and the, garbage poetry. And they don't even pay attention really to the fact that they were largely abusive people to their associates and loved ones. What they fixate on is their irreverence, that kind of like rock and roll spirit. That eventually really would come to the fore in something like the modern rock and roll or I would say early modern rock and roll. People like Jimi Hendrix, not Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page, you know, talking about all this stuff and collecting. They made a record at Boleskine House where Aleister Crowley did he failed at doing the Abramelin, and so it does get mixed up in popular culture, right? Crowley's on the cover of Sergeant Pepper's by the Beatles and stuff. But there was something else that kind of happened, and really in the States, it was this twin movement, but really it started in like the late 50s, early 60s, and moved forward into the 70s with great gusto. You essentially had these splinter orders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, right? The Stella Matutina and the Alpha et Omega. They were splinter orders after a great schism. They continued on past the lives of their founders. That's what Crowley came through. And so everything that Crowley did is also considered Golden Dawn derivative, a sort of, a gross mutilation and mutation of that, but certainly based on Golden Dawn principles. And even if it is just to invert them. Now, you had other groups like Dion Fortune, right, and her Society of the Inner Light. And they're doing a lot of training, but they're bringing it back to this like land-based thing, this Celtic Grail, this Arthurian thing. They're getting very, very nature-based and very almost like folkloric. So, there's a lot of fantasy now intermingled with magic. And of the kind that we would consider genre fantasy, right? And so the groups start coming out of that.
Maybe Tolkien was inspired by a bit of that.
Oh, he was. Yeah, one of the guys that was with the Inklings was a member of the Golden Dawn.
Really?
Yeah, and yeah, oh, absolutely, 110%. He was at the very least aware of those teachings because and I wrote about it in the book. But not to get too far off topic. That kind of nature-based tack on it, and combined with the irreverent kind of, going against the grain. The church doesn't like me, but regular society doesn't like me, and I'm just kind of this loner with my friends, and we dress up like Egyptian pharaohs and wave our wands. Those two attitudes were sort of promulgated, and they intertwined very synchronously, if not harmoniously, in the United States when we were having a counterculture movement. So what happens is it gets wrapped up in the counterculture, and that's when all the scooping happens, where it's like, oh, Christianity is based on esotericism. The religion itself is based on esotericism. These things are related. You go back in the historical records if you read the Greek and understand it. If you even are reading the Hebrew and you understand it. Christianity came more out of Neoplatonism than it did out of Judaism. And so
but it's been stripped out of the churches as well.
Absolutely.
Just like I see it being stripped out of. I like how you highlighted scientism in that role because, I've come across that in my research with like the British Royal Society and then the ushering in of Darwinism. And then eventually that gets kind of pushed out into society through the state. So you've got that secular stripping out of this idea. And then when you look at the church and the modern day church, all that esotericism has been stripped out of that as well. So it's like it's coming from both angles.
Yeah, because what happens is one sort of suppresses and crushes, right? The church and the state crush that stuff. They crush it here and here.
Yeah.
And they push it down and they hide it. But then the groups like, the Thelemic groups and the sort of nature-based groups, the Wiccan groups that come out of, the work of Gerald Gardner, who was affiliated with Crowley and worked Golden Dawn based magic. Uh, those guys that created all this stuff, that's when the scooping happens. And it's like, here we have this thing that is, it's more like symbolic and based on countercultural socio-political statements, socio-political movements, and all of the actual esoteric Christianity, which is the capstone of all of this kind of stuff as we receive it from Martinism, Elu Cohen's Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. All of these lineages, they center around a dying and a resurrecting Christ. Now, that means something completely different in these initiatory orders than it does to the church, even in their day, sure. But at the same time, you've got these organizations in the 60s and 70s that are just removing it completely. Like, just, we don't like this, toss it. Cool, let's hang out with the fairies and pray to Zeus and do stuff like that. And that's great. The Golden Dawners were doing similar stuff too, but the ultimate thing really was this Rosicrucian ideal, a hermetic Christianity, and really like people like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, those guys that really started the Renaissance in Florence in the 1400s. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to renovate the church. I think they called it like a hermetic restoration of the church, or a hermetic reformation. That's what they wanted to call it. That's what it's now referred to. That failed ultimately. So, but that's really where we're at. That's really how and why that happens. We really started getting right, because you got to remember too, in the context of that time, late 1800s, mid 1800s, early 1900s, the monarchies of the world began to fall, right? The czars and the kings and the emperors, all that stuff started to fall. And that's when our world became effectively politicized, right? Because now it was just monarchs, the aristocrats and the serfs. That was it. Now we broke all that up at the top, and now all these groups are fighting for power. And that replaces God, particularly in the modern day. Right? People, they don't care about wrong or right. They don't care about good and evil. They care about dominance hierarchies, resources, things like that. And so it had a really negative effect on the magical societies as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it effectively secularized them.
Yeah, that's well laid out. It gave me a lot to think about there. And I was thinking too about the oppression and the suppression of the alchemists as well. That fits into this timeline somewhere, I know for sure. I mean, like, I think about Johannes Kelpis coming over here in late 1960s, 1690s, I mean. And it seems like he came to Pennsylvania because the religious laws in Pennsylvania at the time were some of the loosest around. But it seems like he was being effectively forced out of Europe because of his beliefs.
Yeah.
And
I mean, another thing though that you do we have to acknowledge is that there were a shitload of alchemists who just took people's money. There was a huge
like snake oil
fraud.
Yeah.
It was pure fraud. Fraud that a lot of them, not the ones that we know now to history. I mean, look even at John Dee, court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, right? He does the angelic sessions. He contacts these angels and asking them for the lost book of Enoch, and instead of giving him a physical book, they deliver to him a language. This is the angelical language. And now it sometimes gets referred to as Enochian or Enochian, and it's used in magic. But Dee didn't interact with these angels in terms of seeing them. He hired a scryer named Edward Kelly. And Edward Kelly was, enigmatic figure. He was checkered. He had a checkered past. We don't really know too much, very much about him anyway, but he, you know, excuse me, managed to impress John Dee. And but there were a couple of weird things during the scrying sessions. Kelly's telling him like the angels say we have to swap wives,
Yeah.
and they do it. And then they get involved with uh I think King Emperor Rudolph II. Um
The Czech Republic, or
yeah,
yeah.
they get really embroiled in the politics of like European politics. And Kelly actually passes himself off as an alchemist. And he is kind of held hostage, there to make gold for the king, and he really
That's
can
right.
never produce it. He kind of lies his way through it, and so he ends up dying imprisoned there. So I would say most of the people that guys like you and me remember are, yeah, it's like we're talking about a much higher level order, but alchemy was kind of suppressed for a decent reason in some areas,
Sure.
um, because there were a lot of grifters. But um, to your point, yeah, I mean, let's say there is an alchemist who's very successful. That's even more of a reason for a ruler to outlaw and alchemy and jail him, because that means this person can spontaneously produce resources, and that's the name of the game, right? In terms of empire is resources. This
Yes.
guy producing gold, like how are we gonna you
Yeah,
know
that person could essentially go off and start their own empire with those kind of resources and become an enemy overnight.
yeah, and or pay an army to take over standing empires,
Yep.
so it's that there could be that too, but
Oh, of course, that's if they really could turn base metals into gold.
right, right,
And
exactly.
and I love all the lore with that, like with Nicholas Flamel and some of the others, and even going back to Paris in the 1940s when the Nazis rolled in, they one of the Nazis, I have to look up his name again, but he was specifically parsing through documents looking for the Philosopher's Stone information because he believed in it. He's like, if anybody has it, it's these notorious Paris alchemists or their remaining material, like Flamel.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting term too, the philosopher's stone. the
Mm,
first the first time we find it on the historical record is in the writings of, I think he's either third or fourth century Egyptian scribe priest, in the domain of clerical activity, um, that worked in metallurgy.
mm.
So they would dye metals for the purposes of producing religious statuary, which is a huge part of Egyptian religion, even in this later Roman period. But he's the first one we have to refer to, the product of alchemy as the philosopher's stone. But I'm pretty sure he calls it a stone, which is not a stone, which is also very interesting. But that's the coolest thing for me, is because, right, as scientism and scientific sort of positivistic reductionism has ascended and completely taken over and really told us, it's erected walls, it's erected a dome even over us and said no other kind of knowledge exists. There is no truth. I am now the arbiter for your experience. You
Yeah.
are outsourcing the validity of your life to me. So once that happens, people really want to they have to abandon this idea of practical laboratory alchemy,
Hmm.
which has always been practiced. It was not an analogy back then. They were producing gold, um, and things like the Philosopher's Stone, the elixir of life. That's well attested even in the ancient Eastern, particularly the Chinese, the Taoist alchemical texts and things like that.
Wow.
But so people start psychologizing it. And they start talking about it as a spiritual, oh, it must be an analogy for spiritual
Yes.
prophecies. And that's where we kind of went wrong, but not entirely. When you go back to Zosimus, he's talking about, look, we do these operations. We're dyeing metals and yada yada yada. And in doing our work, we have found, and this is I'm not quoting him, but I'm summarizing some of his main points. We have found that a pattern exists, and that this pattern not only exists in everything that is created, but that pattern exists in the human body, the human mind, and the human spirit. And so he applies analogy. If we can transmute these things that are actual material, then that same process applies, right? Because there are these constituent forces in everything, this underlying foundational pattern which exists in everything. It is it's essential.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can do this to materials, and we can do this to our souls, and we can do this even to our bodies, and we can do this to our spirit, our energetic, our light body, and that kind of stuff. And so you've got a lot of people think it's very new agey to talk about spiritual alchemy, and then other people say, well, it was, there's no way that they could have been producing gold. And we know now that you can actually do that. It's just in extremely small amounts, and it requires a tremendous amount of energy. But the thing is that, we see from Zosimus at this early stage, it's actually both. It's not one or the other. It's both.
It's both. I was having a conversation with a friend about this, and I think I said, let's say they did figure out how to turn lead or whatever into gold. And I was thinking, like, well, by the time they mastered that, I was thinking, and this was the question I had for my friend, was the process, the learning process, was that more important than actually being able to make gold at that point because of what you've learned along the way, spiritually and metaphysically? Because you can
Yeah.
then take that and apply it to life principles almost.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it applies to everything. I don't know what the exact sort of, what they ended up with in terms of their alchemical symbolic vocabulary. But I mean, if you just look at, Paracelsian alchemy, and a lot of people misattribute the introduction of the third alchemical, the philosophic essential of salt. They misattribute that to Paracelsus. It actually existed before him. It might have been Jabir. One of the Arabic alchemists actually talks about salt, sulfur, sulfur, mercury, and salt. So there we already have the tria prima. But Paracelsus starts really formulating a quite sophisticated system based on it. So let's just say we have the tria prima, and that is the underlying sort of blueprint of how everything can permutate. I did a video on this on my channel too, on Arcanvm, and I explain it there. I explain it in the book. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about how these things manifest from one to everything. But
Well, so Paracelsus may have been reading Jabir, the old Arabic text, which I think that you correct me if I'm wrong, but the Arabs came across that stuff by conquering new lands, and then they come across like old Greek manuscripts.
Well, really, what happened was they didn't so much conquer these new lands so much as there was a series of anti-pagan edicts released by Emperor Theodosius. I think Theodosius either the first or the second, but and so he was an emperor of Rome after Constantine, and he basically said, okay, in the Empire of Rome, you don't have to abandon the temples, but you can't do any of your religious rituals in them anymore. And then finally, the fall of Western Rome took place. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? So the mid-5th century, you see a diaspora. You see these Neoplatonic theurgists, these Hermetic philosophers, these astrologers really migrating to parts east for the most part. And they end up in Byzantium to some degree, right? In the capital city of Constantinople. That is Eastern Rome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those people would not have called themselves Byzantines. We call them that. They would have called themselves Romans.
Right.
Those of a
It was a
definite
made up term, from what I understand.
exact. All terms are made up.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Good point.
They went there, and then they even went further to the Perso-Arabic Islamic empires. I mean, Baghdad and the House of Wisdom that was built there under the Abbasid Caliphate. This was built for this stuff. They were so welcoming and so friendly to this material and these philosophers that actually they began to experience a renaissance, a golden age. And it was the same thing in the 1400s when Marsilio Ficino, Lodovico Lazzarelli, under the auspices mostly of Cosimo de' Medici, right, the Florentine sort of merchant dynasty, they, actually found all these lost manuscripts and translated them into Latin. Neoplatonic, Platonic, Hermetic, all that stuff, and then the Renaissance happened. So it's like wherever this stuff moves is a complete Renaissance period. So the Perso-Arabic Islamic Empire welcomed them, and then they experienced an Islamic Golden Age. And what they did was they elaborated these texts. They bent very, very Aristotelian. They became very, very interested in alchemy, and we actually get from them a prototype of the periodic table of elements. So they become very, very, they're very technically minded. They like math. They like that kind of clockwork sort of thing. They love codifying and adding and subtracting. I mean, look at it now, right? Our numeral system is Arabic, right? All of our numbers that we use, they're an Arabic numeral system. That's more so how they kind of came upon those documents, but we ended up finding them because of the Crusades. So, like a particularly good example is the siege and fall of Toledo by King Alfonso, the Christian king, King Alfonso VI. He sieges the city of Toledo in Spain, in Al-Andalus, that was controlled by the Muslims. And then once he gets in there, they discover these libraries that have these magical texts, and they get brought back, and they're not really exchanged far and wide. The priests keep them kind of quietly, like I'm not supposed to be doing this. And from that, actually, that is one of the ways that we get the Western grimoire tradition. So
Incredible.
it
all
is
goes back to an old book.
Yeah.
Or old books. Yeah. I love this too. I love that your personal story, it seems like this goes back to that old book you found, the Oracle of the Kabbalah. That's amazing. Do you ever come across something like that where you almost have that same reaction to put it under the jacket, right? And just not tell anyone because it's so sacred? Because I've come across books where I felt like I shouldn't just go on a podcast and put them on blast. There's one book I came across in particular, where the first couple lines in the book, the first chapter, kind of tells you not to put it on blast in so many words or less.
None of this stuff should be talked about, especially not in a forum that's going to be broadcast. But that, the profanation of the mysteries has already occurred. So at this point, we got to do everything we can to kind of make sure that some vestige of, its more initial, or maybe say, important to the history and development of humanity. So those forms should be preserved. And so we kind of have to engage in this discourse. But I agree with you that, like, the stuff that I talk about, put it this way, I believe in being quiet in my work and study. What does that mean? I don't seem quiet in my work and study. Well, it's because I'm not currently working on anything I'm talking about.
Yes.
Like the audience is getting 5, 6, 7-year-old material because the phenomenology of the practice of magic, meaning the experiences, it becomes more profound to the degree that you keep the quote unquote alembic hermetically sealed, meaning your experiments, your practices, your studies, your mantras, whatever it is, the stuff you're writing for those purposes, is it, don't talk about it to anyone. Don't take pictures of it. Like, come on. Just practice quietly, do your work and focus and cultivate that intimate relationship and strengthen that connection to the divine and divine intermediaries, truly, that are your psychopomps in this process, that are your mentors, your teachers in this process, and your collaborators, your facilitators in this process. So books to me now, especially old books, like I understand the language of occultism and really esoteric symbol systems. I know what it all means basically, and I know kind of what it is, where it's meant to go, what it means to symbolize. So I don't look at books and I don't look at the contents of books and think, this is highly mystical. I look at it, I'm like, I could hold it up to the screen like this. I don't think anyone, maybe one, two people, if it gets a million views, are going to understand what any of this means. So there's part of it that is an open secret or a self-kept secret, but intention plays a large part. You see that a lot in occultists, particularly the ones that are like just very, very vocal and just kind of out there causing issues with people, and they want to use these things like a ladder. They're very ambitious. Crowley was like that. They might kid themselves for a little bit that, hey, I'm interested in the spiritual component, but at the end of the day, it's one big gigantic coattail to them, and it's a way of posturing and pretending to holding some sort of esoteric knowledge, which is so mysterious, and that aesthetic is so powerful that people are just drawn to it for pure curiosity at this point. At this point, it's become a trend. But I would say this, if there's anything,
Maybe some books are supposed to find you as well. There might be an aspect of that to this. And I think, too, with that book I was referring to, I think the instruction included in that book not to just go out and tell people about it was so that the book could find you when the time was right, kind of a thing.
Yeah, and I mean, even like in something like an esoteric order, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, you are admonished to strict silence and to secrecy. Why is that? Well, it's for one of the reasons I said before, is that you don't want to open the oven, right? When you've got 20 minutes left, let all that heat out.
Yeah.
Right? The alembic has to stay hermetically sealed. The circulation has to not be stopped. It must be continuous. So there's that, but also that level of discipline and detachment from how this makes you look in the eyes of others, or how it makes you feel special and unique and privileged compared to others. That is a poison that will destroy your work from the outset. So it's part
in the Bible it says God hates a haughty eye.
Absolutely.
People who have that sort of attitude towards other people, feeling privileged and going so far as to look at someone with judgment because you're so enveloped in your privilege.
Yeah, and also, the intention behind it. You look at the New Testament where Christ basically he chastises the Pharisees for praying in the street and beating their chests and making a scene. And he tells his followers, when you pray, go into a closet in the room all the way in the back of your house and pray quietly and simply, because your Father sees you and he sees your heart. So the intention behind all of it is really, for me, that's the determining factor of pretty much any and all outcomes. So yeah, secrecy and silence, that kind of silence, that privacy is something that we're becoming estranged from as a civilization, so.
Yeah. My just talking about books got me thinking. My favorite author, I think, has changed. If I wonder, because I used to have a favorite author, but I wonder now if I go back and read his books, if I'm going to feel the same way about them. And because I was really into Jack Kerouac, but we change, and so do our interests and stuff like that. But what do you have a favorite author?
That's so funny. I was a huge fan of Kerouac in my early 20s. I'm not gonna lie, I read it now and I'm like, this stuff is bullshit. I hate it. I hate it. It's so disingenuous,
Hmm.
and so full of itself. I could picture Kerouac with like a large beer and his writing notes, and he's just wafting his own methane into his face because he's so in love with himself. But I I don't have a favorite author. I think that's very hard because for me at this point, if I'm reading particularly more than one book, uh, they're now teachers to me, in a
Sure.
way. So uh, I don't necessarily have a favorite author. That's really, really hard for
It's
me. But I will say that there are some authors that have influenced me more than others, and in the past.
there's like a golden moment for some of these authors like Kerouac too, because it didn't start out for him like that. He's one of those guys who I think saw some fame within his lifetime, and maybe it was enough for it to go to his head. But if you go back and you look at some more humble works of his, like Desolation Angels, where
Mhm.
half the book he's on a mountain, isolated. He's
Mhm.
purposefully isolated himself for, I don't know, maybe a year up there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
you know,
he takes a job up there as a
yeah.
ranger, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like he's a fire lookout
Yeah.
ranger. And but it's him having a like an exploration moment of the soul.
Yeah.
But then later you get the rock star Kerouac, right? Who's full of himself.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And then I look at my heroes and I'm like, this guy died like of cirrhosis of the liver next to train tracks. I'm like, that's
Exactly.
not something to aspire to, So
Exactly.
well,
Yeah.
because at a certain point in your magical training, right, and your esoteric training and your initiatory training, you learn that I must the same way I control what goes in and out of my mouth, you know, I must now learn to control what goes into my mind. My mental diet must be curated. Otherwise, because that is a concept that's completely foreign to us, because first of all, we are people who crave overstimulation, and we are people who are just used to being barraged with images, sounds, lights, colors, words, messaging, marketing. So becoming a little bit more um, using discernment and intelligent, wise discrimination over what is mentally consumed and what you spend your time on and doing, right? Because time is a non-recoupable resource. It's the only one.
Yes.
So that is a big part of esoteric training. In terms of authors that have really shaped my perspective, there's Dion Fortune. I've read almost every one of her books. I visited her grave in Glastonbury. I definitely consider her a teacher to me, from through the ages.
Mm,
Um, Jamie Paul Lamb, really, his writings, particularly on Freemasonry and astrology, changed my life,
mm.
my outlook. John Michael Greer's work is just some of the best teaching you can get. John's not like other authors where he's got to couch things and make you impressed at how mystical and intelligent his words are. He's just a damn good teacher. He knows the material in and out, through and through, up and down, and he teaches it in a way where it's not pretentious and it's accessible to almost everyone. So he's a great teacher. Chick and Tabby Cicero, they're the chiefs of my order. They have initiated me into the inner Rosicrucian order, the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn. Um, but I read their books for many years before I knew them, and I continue to read their writings and their articles and their journal essays and things like that, and they're huge teachers to me. And then, I mean, it's for me, if we're talking ancient literature, It's the Platonic and Neoplatonic stuff. Iamblichus, even some, what we can get a Porphyry, Plato himself. I think that's the best place for anybody that's interested in esotericism to start, right? I mean, it's a miracle that we have all of Plato's dialogues. That doesn't happen over the course of 2,500 years. We have them all. We even have his letters. Some of them are attested, but we have the entire Platonic corpus. And when you read through them without some philosophy teacher, philosophy 101, University of Albany, a teacher or something like that, telling you how you should be thinking about it, installing perceptual software that you now have to filter these words through in order to pass a test. When you don't have that, it really becomes immediately apparent that the Platonic dialogues are quintessentially mystical documents. I mean, there's in Book 10 of the Republic, there's the myth of That is one of the earliest out-of-body, near-death experiences. He talks about the soldier dies on the battlefield. His soul doesn't just leave his body, it leaves the cosmos. And it tells us, like, what's on the other side, what he saw. And then, Socrates has a spirit that tells him what not to do, that talks to him throughout his life, called the daimon. I mean, most people are not aware that these are like the major points in the Platon, some of the major points in the Platonic tradition. They're just simply not aware that they exist.
Yeah, that connection that you talked about earlier, the Platonic influence on Christianity, that's not a perspective I hear much.
And you won't, because it's controversial. And I think, but there is a growing group. First of all, it's basically consensus in academia. But there is a small group of people that are now becoming very vocal about it. I am one of them. And it's all predicated on, well, I'll give you an example. When I say Plato, Plato gives the let's call it analogically the alphabet of the system, right? So you get or the color palette. This is what we're working in. We got these colors. This is what's on our Bob Ross color palette. That's it. Now what happens is you have later philosophers, the Middle Platonists and the Late Platonists, who are also known as the Neoplatonists, that begin using these things and painting with them and mixing colors and drawing different things. And then by the time we get to Neoplatonism, there is a beautiful, vast tapestry made from these colors. And it's not completely unrecognizable. It has to remain consonant with itself. So let's take, for example, the Platonic philosopher Tertullian, right? The Neoplatonic. Obviously, Origen is another one. Clement of Alexandria. These people were trained in Neoplatonism. They were at least familiar with Neoplatonism. So there was a doctrine specifically in Neoplatonism, referred to as the three hypostases. Hypostasis means to stand under, right? And so that what that means is the three foundations of everything. The three foundations which were in the beginning and from which everything is created, right? Tohen, the one, nous, the intellect or mind, and psyche, the soul. And these are not three different things. These are three phases of activity, or three modes of one thing. So Tertullian, schooled in Neoplatonism, converts to Christianity. He becomes a church father. So he imports this doctrine that he said he defined as tre personae una substantia, three persons, one substance, into Christian theology that now Christians refer to as the Holy Trinity. Nowhere in the Bible does it reference the Holy Trinity. We get the Father, we get the Son, we get the Holy Spirit, but nowhere is it referred to that these are three persons or three things, one substance. That comes later, So in many ways, this is how Platonism informs Christianity. But also, what you have to remember is at the time of the Christ event, right? Last few centuries BC, or the last century BCE, the first century CE, right? That whole nexus. What was going on? Well, Alexander had conquered Egypt. really conquered Persia, and he got Egypt because the Persians had been terrible rulers to them for about 200 years. So that Greek and Egyptian culture that
Yes.
have been touching each other, playing tag, it finally reaches this apex moment, and boom, just an
Perfect.
explosion of everything. That right at that time we get the appearance on the historical record of the first iteration of modern alchemy, the first iteration of modern astrology, and really, ceremonial magic, which is what we call theurgy. But most importantly, we get a lot of Greco-Egyptian, or what we would call Hellenistic. We get a lot of Hellenistic penetration into Hebrew culture, because at the time of the first century in Alexandria, Egypt, 35 to 40% of the population was Jewish. And from this period, you get the Septuagint translation, which is the translation of all the Hebrew texts into Greek.
Yes.
You get the Merkava texts, right? The Hekkalot material, which is Hebrew, sort of mystical theurgy, this ascent that's predicated on Platonic cosmology, Platonic terms, this whole kind of schema that's laid out, and also the Christ event. So it's all happening. It's if it is um, Jewish or Hebrew, it's really Greco-Egyptian Hellenistic philosophy, theurgic philosophy, this philosophy of the immortal soul and how that pertains to us on earth. It's that through the lens of that kind of esoteric Judaism that was happening. That's why it was a heresy.
Hmm. How about that Greek Egyptian fusion there? It's almost like Alexandria was a religious hub of the ancient world. In terms of, we think about Jerusalem today, or the Vatican, where especially Jerusalem, where you have a representation of all of these major current world religions. But I like looking back at these places like Alexandria and seeing the influence that came out of a place like that. And I'm glad you brought up Egypt, because I was going to go there actually.
Like physically or in the conversation?
No, in the conversation,
Oh,
unfortunately, well, I could always go to Egypt, but I missed a chance when I was younger, and I'm still kicking myself for that. But I know you went to Egypt because I've heard you mention this before.
yeah.
And
Well,
go ahead.
I'm actually, if you're interested, and I want your listeners to hear this, obviously, I'm leading a field immersive excursion that's being hosted by Argos Destinations. We are doing 9 days in Egypt in October 18th to the 26th. I'm going to be leading a group of 16 participants there. We're going through Upper and Lower Egypt. We are going to study the history, theory, but most importantly, the practice of Greco-Egyptian theurgic magic. And we have private access to most of these temples. Private access to the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, private access to the Sanctuary of Sekhmet, private access to the Osirian in at Abydos, and we even have a private island, King's Island, in the middle of the Nile that we're going to be staying on for 3 days. And I'll be working hands on with this small group of practitioners to teach the history, the theory, and the philosophy, but mainly the practice of it. And I've structured the curriculum, I've curated, I've reconstructed these things from primary source materials and my experience, trained in these traditions of operative spirituality. And I've curated the material so that it's actually going to serve as a personal initiatory journey for each of the practitioners. So there's some onboarding work to do to prepare for that with them, and it's relatively straightforward, and very low cost for that portion of it. The preparatory stuff, but it's going to be a phenomenal trip, and we do have. We have a few seats left. Registration is open till March 21st. And if anybody wants to know more about that, I'll give you the link to post. Okay.
Yeah, great. I'll post that. We were talking about authors, and some of my favorite books currently have virtually these unknown authors. They deal with I've got a pile of books that deals with the Native Americans right now, and just some of these guys just really went in there and tried to extract as much information as they could. And what I walked away with was that the Native Americans just simply didn't see the world the way we do. They saw the spirit world around them. And I was going to ask you, do you see a trait like that in the ancient Egyptians, where they just it's almost like a modern man can't fathom how they thought because they were so enriched by the spirit world. The two Egypts, that whole thing, right?
Yeah. Well, there's something that you said there that's important. Modern people can't understand the way they think. We like to very retrospectively paint everyone with the brush of our own time, right? And color and place.
Yeah.
But that's not how it worked. Really, the more you familiarize yourself with not only the material, but the practice and the underlying worldview, you really see that the presence, not only the presence, but the collaboration, the participation that they had with the spiritual realms was such an ingrained daily part of their lives. And it's still there. Modern magicians, adepts of certain traditions, senior adepts of certain traditions, basically arrive at the same state of being. I can't fathom how people don't see this stuff and interact with this stuff and understand it at its most foundational reality. The fact that it is the foundational reality for everything we're experiencing, and that that door is always open. That door is always open to everyone. But it's just like we live different lifestyles and we dismiss certain things out of hand, right?
Hmm.
Immediately, because
Hmm.
our factory installed setting, our worldview that it's just crammed into our heads from the time we're old enough to think, it prevents us from even looking in that direction. So I mean, yeah, I could deny that my closet door exists if I never look to my right. People could be standing here looking at me saying, "It's right there, turn around." And I'm like, "No, I don't we don't turn around. That's not what we do. That's not science." So
Yeah.
once you learn to kind of like just rip that whatever it is, parasite out of your ear, you can begin to synthesize the two, right? Because they both matter. They both need each other in the person to really understand what we're seeing, right? Because people who
Hmm.
just abandon themselves to that kind of symbolic reality of spirits in the modern day, you could go insane. In today's society, you will not be productive. Okay, you're so
Yeah.
so it's you really need both. But the Egyptians for sure. I mean, they tell us all about it. That was the most brazen thing. One of the most brazen things about the Egyptians is that they believed that they could participate in divine creation and the maintenance and sustenance of the universe with the gods. I mean, they had that level of balls where it's like,
Mm.
I'm commanding Ra to do this, or I'm commanding Horus to do that. A lot of the times it's related to in the funerary text where they're telling the gods to recognize this pharaoh as one of them, recognize his Ba, his soul, as one of their own, and pass him through the gates of night in the underworld so that he can rise as the sun with Ra on the solar, boat into the heavens in the day of deliverance. That's why the Egyptian Book of the Dead is really better referred to as the book of coming forth by day. And so it's about getting through that underworld realm that the soul is first in when you die, and like letting go and achieving safe passage into the light, the realm of light, right? That
Hmm.
heavenly light, that glorious heavenly splendor.
Wow. It's just what blows my mind with that is there's this belief, it seems like, in two Egypts that they had, where you have like almost like a mirrored version of the city itself in the underworld. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that as a
Yeah.
modern person, of course.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was part of their worldview, it was based on a dichotomy
Hmm.
because,
Yes.
first of all, if you've ever been to Egypt, you know why they were so acutely aware of the sun because it's huge, it's bright, it's hot, and there's no clouds. So you just watch it no matter what time of day it is, you feel where the sun is
Yeah.
like directly beating down on you. Um, and the first dichotomy, other than day and night, right? That diurnal cycle that they would have been well aware of, but also the Nile itself, splitting the kingdom into east and west banks of the River Nile. So they looked at their whole, right, the city of Thebes, which during the Middle Kingdom was the seat of power, right?
Mm.
It straddles the Nile to this day. And so on the West Bank, the place where the sun sets, all the mortuary temples, all the caverns and caves and tombs of these pharaohs, it was just for dying.
Hmm.
And then on the East Bank, in the place where the sun rises, that's where they had their palaces. That's where they had their political centers, their markets and things like that. But on the west side, associated with Amenti, right, the hinterland of the Duad, the underworld, the place where the sun sets. That's where you go to die. So that's all the mortuary temple. Valley of the Kings is there, etc. And what's really interesting too is that they didn't really have in Egyptian a word for death. They just called it westing. And even Osiris, the lord of the underworld, he's one of his epithets in Egyptian is the first Westerner, the first one to die.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Because it's not, they're not perceiving it as death in the way we think of it. It's just moving on, almost like a new a stage in your development or
Yes.
something.
It's the night time of life. That's what it is. Like I in the daytime of life, I'm in a physical body, and in the night, I mean, Plato kind of throws that idea on its head. In a lot of ways, in the Platonic corpus, let's say that's initiated, right? Because he's attested to have studied under a Horite priest in Egypt, a priest of Horus, and that priest's name is supposed to have been Seknufis. And Plato turns it on his head, and he basically says, "What if this is the nighttime of life?" Right? He uses in the Socratic dialogue, he uses this term, and he uses it around certain ideas that he suggests very gently that he comes back to later more strongly, and it's based on this wordplay that's soma sema, which is translated, right, they sound alike, and he puts them next to each other, soma sema. It's translated as body tomb, or body tomb, the body as the tomb of the soul. And that's essentially what all of theurgy is predicated on. Why do theurgy? What do you mean you got to rise and ascend and achieve union with the divine? Well, we have a very, very romantic, idealized idea of what these ancient pagans believed in terms of their metaphysics, their theories of the soul and the afterlife. We think it's very Judeo Christian to think of the soul as fallen or embodied. That is the case in Platonism, and the traditions that were derived from it. One of them being the Hermetic tradition. A lot of people like to very deceptively say, and it's all wrapped up with this idea that the Greeks were colonizers because everything's like, it's politicized hyperbole at this point. But so they want to talk about the Hermetic tradition as quintessentially Egyptian. It's not. There's not a single Hermetic document that predates the Platonic dialogues. And not only that, they're all written in Greek or Coptic. And most of Coptic is the Greek alphabet and Greek words like logos, word, nous, mind, psyche, soul. It's the same verbiage in the same alphabets, in the same sort of jargon or vernacular. So it's really astounding how well preserved this transmission really has been.
Wow. Wow. We'll wind down with this. because I appreciate your time today, and this has been great. I think you mentioned astrology earlier. I keep kind of catching myself having these thoughts that maybe something weird is going to happen this year or something, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I've been putting it off, but I'll be like, I just have this inkling that something might happen. I don't know what that is, but what do you foresee for this year? Anything? I know that might be a tough question, but
It's not tough. It's not
okay.
tough. I've spent the last 2 months, you know, doing my own sort of astrological forecasting and at the same time
Oh,
listening to other people's astrological forecasting. I mean, at this point, at a certain point of you know, your lifestyle when you become involved in these things, I mean, that's probably like getting, I don't know, going and getting your oil changed. Like it's just something you have to do. You just do it regularly. Look at the astrology and stuff like that. So, but the thing is that I don't want to scare people and I don't want to come across as alarmist. Usually I'm totally fine with that, but I'm making I'm making a concerted effort to be a little gentler than I have in the past. Not for my public image, but because I think that being, I think, honest and forthcoming and maybe blunt isn't always the right tool for the job. It's not always the right tool. But I would say at this point, the way out is the way through. Lots of things can change, right? There is we get bogged down in this idea of free will versus determinism in astrology, and much like the stuff we were talking about before, it's both. The manifest universe is composed of a deterministic component and a free will component. I mean, that should be obvious to everyone. It's just I don't know why we need to have just one of those answers. Constantly people just want no, no, no. If one exists, the other one can't. And that's like saying, look, well, then if night exists, then day can't exist, right? But it's like, well, you don't understand the mechanisms of how they're related. And that's really what we're doing. And so determinism and free will are inexorably linked. They actually define each other. And there's this push pull and this interplay that's quite beautiful. That makes a life and makes history and makes, phenomenality. But so there are choices that are going to come, and we're going to be able to make them. I see conflict. I would say probably. I would probably say a conflict of the kind that is martial and diffuse. Uh, I also see a lot of potential for individual growth, potential for self-reliance if one is open to those ideas of becoming more self-reliant in your life, on your property, in your home, and that kind of stuff. But I will definitely say that this is a year to end all years, meaning I think that after this, and we've been moving towards that for about a good 5 or 6 years, but I think this is the final year where anything will look remotely the same. I think everything is going to change after this, but there is that free will component where, okay, here's the deterministic stuff. Now you have the freedom of choice, how you respond. I think everything's going to take on a very martial tone. People are going to get more militaristic and entrenched in their approaches and in the way that they approach the world and each other, particularly in the United States. We're going to see continual bifurcation, but ultimately, like, some of that is good, right? Some of that is good, but we don't. I think the temptation here is going to be to lean to willingly throw ourselves too far into destructive modes of being, whereas now it's like, okay, we're all geared up for some kind of war with each other, whether it's
yeah.
online or whether it's an actual war. Um,
Certainly mental war. There's a lot
yeah,
of, wow.
exactly. Spiritual war. And then we're going to want to, I think, take a breath before we squeeze the trigger or swing the sword. Take that breath, take that moment, and really
Yeah.
think about creating space where you can say, this is where my choice is. This space I have created between the thing that triggered me and my reaction, this is where I have power.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to sit here on the sidelines and take that breath and be ready for whatever. Because typically, historically, for me, when I get some sort of a feeling that something's going to happen, a lot of times it does happen. And it's not because I'm special or I'm an empath or whatever. It's just, I don't know. I've just been clued into things before. And again, I hope I'm wrong, but you see this terminology like the golden age being used again. And, that's something that I've read coming out of the Theosophists
Mhm.
in the late 1800s. So I find that interesting.
Yeah,
But
and I mean, I think all of us, or many of us, to a degree, are having some form of that inner stirring, right? I think
mm,
that you could have a lot of money right now, and you could be living very comfortably. And I know several people that are indeed in that exact position. Um, but it doesn't really seem like anyone can be at peace right now. There's something making every moment just slightly tinted with anxiety, And then it's like, is it the political thing? Like maybe for some people, but I kind of detach myself from sides and outcomes, and I'm still feeling what I refer to as an existential dread.
beautiful. Hmm.
Yeah, well, not hopeful,
No,
but
it's not, but it's brilliant the way you worded it. That's for sure. The way you worded it, I knew exactly what you meant. I felt that. But I don't always listen back to my episodes. This is going to be one I'm probably going to go back and listen to because the body of information that we've covered today is great. And, how's that for, ladies and gentlemen, Ike Baker? How's that for a history lesson meets a religious philosophical exegesis? So incredible.
thanks.
Tell everyone where they can find you.
IkeBaker.com, IkeBaker.com has all of my stuff. Um, the latest YouTube video from Arcanvm, which is I do documentary style presentations on esotericism, etc. I've got my 3 of the latest episodes of the podcast. I interview a lot of really, really brilliant authors, practitioners, and just authorities in the field. Yeah, some of my blog is up there. You can buy my book. You can register and find out more about the trip to Egypt. And also, something that I've got coming up, I've got a lot of speaking dates. I'm going to be in Los Angeles at the Philosophical Research Society on June 12th. I'm going to be speaking at Esotericon in Manassas, Virginia on June 14th. That is open to the public. I'm going to be at Watkins Books in London, giving a presentation on my next book that's coming out on um, April 23rd. And I'm going to be posting some of these travel dates up on my website soon. The last thing is that I do have a new book coming out. It's practical, but it deals with sort of the energy work and the traditions of energetics behind ritual. Not very well codified in the Western tradition, but very strongly codified and systematized in the Eastern traditions. I also have a background in Chinese medicine and Qigong and some martial arts. So I did those kind of at the same time. And I realized, Western magic is missing that component. And so I used the symbolism and the symbol systems of alchemy and the Kabbalah, specifically the Tree of Life and the Middle Pillar in the West, to sort of construct a method of using this energy work for ritual, for healing, for whatever else you want to do. And also there's practicums in it on how to sense energy, to see it, to feel it, tactilely, and to perceive it. That book's called Etheric Magic, A Complete System of Elemental, Celestial, and Alchemical Magic. Llewellyn Worldwide is publishing it on April 8th of this year.
Excellent. Something to look forward to there. There will be links below the episode for everyone to check out Ike's stuff. The way out is the way through. As always, break the mold, conquer the realm, and thanks for listening.